A single sheet of paper rests in a climate-controlled display case at the British National Archives. Its edges slightly worn, the typewritten text faded but still legible. Visitors pass by it daily, most unaware that this unremarkable document once altered the course of history and saved thousands of lives. What appears to be a mundane personal letter from one officer to another became one of the most consequential pieces of deception in military history, a prime example of how psychological warfare operates not through brute force, but through the subtle manipulation of perception and the exploitation of how the human mind processes information under pressure. The story of this letter opens a window into the shadowy world of wartime deception, where nothing was as it seemed, and where reality itself became a battlefield just as contested as any stretch of European soil during humanity's darkest hours. In the spring of 1943, as Allied forces prepared to launch their first major assault on Hitler's fortress Europe, a corpse wearing the uniform of a Royal Marines officer washed ashore near Huelva on the Spanish coast. Clutched in a leather briefcase chained to his wrist was this letter, seemingly insignificant correspondence never intended for German eyes, yet deliberately designed to reach them through a calculated understanding of human psychology, institutional dynamics, and the fog of war that clouds all military decision-making. The beaches of Sicily shimmer under the Mediterranean sun as German engineers work frantically to reinforce coastal defenses, their labor directed by a decision made thousands of miles away in Berlin, a decision based entirely on a fiction. This fiction began months earlier in a basement room in London, where a small group of intelligence officers gathered around a table contemplating the most pressing problem of the war: how to convince the enemy that the upcoming invasion would target Greece and Sardinia rather than the actual target of Sicily. Operation Husky, the Allied invasion of Sicily, faced a fundamental challenge. Sicily was the obvious choice for an invasion, and the Germans knew it. The geography made it clear. Sicily offered the shortest crossing point from the Allied-held North Africa to Europe. Military logic dictated Sicily must be the target, which meant the Germans would concentrate their defenses there. Breaking this logical chain required something extraordinary, something that would override rational analysis with a more powerful psychological force. The answer came in what would become known as Operation Mincemeat, a deception so audacious that it seemed destined to fail, yet succeeded precisely because of its understanding of how the human mind processes information, particularly when that information confirms existing fears or desires. The operation centered on that single letter, carried by a man who never existed, delivering a message that was entirely false, yet would be believed precisely because of its apparent insignificance and seeming authenticity. Charles Cholmondeley and Ewan Montagu sat in the dimly lit room of the 20 Committee, the British counterintelligence unit responsible for running double agents against Nazi Germany. The air hung heavy with cigarette smoke as they contemplated their impossible task. Cholmondeley, tall and eccentric with his wild mustache and pince-nez glasses, proposed an outlandish idea drawn from an old detective novel: plant false documents on a corpse and make the enemy believe they had intercepted genuine secret correspondence. Montagu, a sharp-minded naval intelligence officer with legal training, immediately recognized the psychological principles that could make such a scheme work. They understood something fundamental about the nature of deception. The most believable lies are those that appear not to be intended to deceive at all. Information that seems accidentally discovered is trusted more than information directly presented. A classified document apparently never meant to be seen by enemy eyes would carry more weight than any propaganda broadcast or leaflet drop. This insight into human psychology formed the cornerstone of their plan, but execution would require meticulous attention to the smallest details, for the Nazi intelligence apparatus was sophisticated and suspicious. They needed to create not just documents, but an entire person with a history, personality, and believable reasons for carrying sensitive information. A fictional officer they would come to call Major William Martin of the Royal Marines. The search for the right body proved challenging. They needed a fresh corpse that would appear to be the victim of an aircraft crash at sea. Through connections at St. Pancras Hospital, they eventually obtained the body of a young man who had died from pneumonia, his lungs already filled with fluid as would be consistent with drowning. The young man's identity remains a carefully guarded secret even today, but his body would become the vessel for an elaborate fiction that would reach to the highest levels of the Nazi high command. Preservation became the next challenge. Corpse would need to appear as a recent drowning victim when it reached Spanish shores. Montague consulted pathologists who advised keeping the body refrigerated until the last possible moment. Meanwhile, Cholmondeley meticulously crafted Major Martin's identity. Every item carried by the fictional officer needed to tell part of his story without appearing too obvious. A photograph of a fictional fiancée named Pam, actually a clerk from MI5, love letters scented with perfume, ticket stubs from recent London shows, keys, cigarettes, an ID card slightly worn as would be natural, each item selected to build a convincing picture of a real officer with a real life. The fictitious Major Martin emerged as a somewhat careless but lovable character, the kind of officer who would carry both official documents and personal items in his briefcase, exactly the sort of person whose briefcase contents would be believed if discovered. The most crucial element, however, was the letter that would mislead the entire German High Command. It was drafted as personal correspondence from Lieutenant General Sir Archibald Nye, Vice Chief of the Imperial General Staff, to General Sir Harold Alexander in Tunisia. The psychological brilliance of the letter lay in its apparent authenticity and its casual, almost careless reference to the strategic deception. Nye wrote about various military matters and then mentioned, almost as an aside, that they were planning diversionary operations to make the Germans think we are aiming at Sicily, which is not the real target. The letter suggested that the actual invasions would target Greece and Sardinia. This approach exploited a fundamental aspect of human psychology. Information perceived as secret or accidentally discovered is often given more weight than information openly provided. The Germans would trust what they had stolen far more than what the Allies might tell them directly. The letter was written not to be too obvious. It needed to seem like genuine correspondence between two high-ranking officers who had no expectation it would be read by enemy eyes. The psychological subtlety extended to the letter's physical preparation. It was typed on appropriate letterhead, folded and refolded as if read multiple times, with a signature in the same ink as that used by the real General Nye. These details might seem trivial, but the operations planners understood that authenticity emerges from the accumulation of such small truths, creating a foundation upon which the central lie could be built. The body of Major Martin, complete with the carefully prepared briefcase, was transported by submarine to the Spanish coast and released to wash ashore near Huelva on April 30, 1943. Spain, though officially neutral, was known to have strong Axis sympathies and a network of German intelligence agents. The planners selected this location precisely because they understood the institutional dynamics at play. Spanish officials would likely allow German agents to examine the documents before returning them to British authorities. This understanding of how different organizations interact under pressure was another key psychological dimension of the operation. When the body washed ashore, Spanish authorities recovered it as expected. Major Martin was buried with military honors in Huelva, while his belongings, including the crucial briefcase, were eventually returned to British authorities. The British made a show of concern about the briefcase, anxiously inquiring whether it had been opened, inadvertently signaling its importance. This performance added another layer of psychological manipulation, reinforcing the document's apparent authenticity through the British reaction. Meanwhile, just as the planners had anticipated, Spanish officials had allowed German intelligence to examine and photograph the documents before their return. In Berlin, the letter made its way through German intelligence channels, its journey tracked by British double agents working within the German system. The information reached Admiral Wilhelm Canaris, head of the Abwehr, German military intelligence, who passed it up to the German High Command and eventually to Hitler himself. The psychological impact of the letter was immediate and powerful. It confirmed what many German leaders already suspected, that the obvious target of Sicily might be a feint, with the real attack coming elsewhere. This played directly into Hitler's personal psychology and his existing paranoia about a Balkan attack. Hitler had long feared that the Allies would strike through what he called Europe's soft underbelly in Greece, threatening his control of the Balkans and the crucial Romanian oil fields. The letter confirmed his pre-existing fears, making its deception all the more effective by aligning with his psychological biases. This represents a crucial insight into the nature of successful psychological warfare. It works best not when it attempts to implant entirely new ideas, but when it reinforces existing beliefs, fears, or hopes. Hitler ordered reinforcements diverted from Sicily to Greece, weakening the defenses at the actual invasion site. The German 1st Panzer Division was moved from France to Greece, and additional forces were sent to Sardinia. Even more significantly, General Erwin Rommel was dispatched to Greece to oversee its defense, removing one of Germany's most capable commanders from the actual theater of operations. The psychological dimensions of Operation Mincemeat extended beyond the immediate military deception. The operation exploited institutional dynamics within the Nazi regime that made it particularly vulnerable to this kind of deception. Hitler's leadership style created an environment where subordinates were afraid to question information that confirmed the Führer's existing views. Once Hitler accepted the letter as genuine, few within his circle would dare suggest it might be a deception. Additionally, competing intelligence agencies within the Nazi regime, the Abwehr, the SD, Sicherheitsdienst, and military intelligence, often worked at cross purposes, failing to properly analyze and challenge information that passed through their systems. These institutional vulnerabilities created fertile ground for the deception to take root and flourish. The operation also benefited from the broader context of the war in 1943. The Germans had already experienced several major setbacks, including defeat at Stalingrad and the loss of North Africa. This created a psychological environment of uncertainty and anxiety among German leadership, making them more susceptible to deception operations that played on their fears. When people are under stress and facing potential failure, their critical thinking abilities often become compromised, making them more likely to grasp at information that seems to offer clarity or advantage. As Allied forces prepared for the actual invasion of Sicily in July 1943, the success of Operation Mincemeat became evident. German forces remained dispersed, with significant numbers deployed to Greece and Sardinia, awaiting invasions that would never come. The Nazi high command had been thoroughly deceived by a single letter carried by a dead man who never existed. When the actual invasion of Sicily began on July 10th, the Allied forces faced much less resistance than expected. Though the landing was not without casualties, historians estimate that thousands of Allied lives were saved because of the reduced German defensive strength. Even as evidence mounted that Sicily was indeed the actual invasion target, Hitler remained convinced, for crucial days, that this was merely a diversion and that the main attack would still come in Greece. This psychological momentum of the deception, tendency to hold on to a belief even as contrary evidence emerges, provided the Allies with precious time to establish and expand their beachhead. The Sicily campaign proved successful, providing the Allies with their first foothold in Europe and a staging ground for the later invasion of mainland Italy. This strategic success, facilitated by a psychological operation centered on a single letter, demonstrates how understanding and exploiting the human mind can sometimes achieve what military might alone cannot. The success of Operation Mincemeat reveals several fundamental principles about the nature of psychological warfare that extend far beyond this specific historical example. First, it demonstrates that the most effective deceptions are those that seem not to be deceptions at all. Information discovered accidentally or obtained through apparently clandestine means carries inherent credibility. Second, successful psychological operations often work by reinforcing existing beliefs rather than attempting to implant entirely new ones. They exploit what the target already fears or hopes. Third, the operation shows how institutional dynamics and organizational psychology can be weaponized. The competition between intelligence agencies, the pressure not to contradict leadership, and the bureaucratic inertia of large military organizations all contributed to the deception's success. Fourth, it highlights how physical artifacts, the body, the personal items, the worn documents, create a sense of authenticity that purely informational deception lacks. The tangibility of the evidence made the fiction more believable. Finally, it demonstrates that in warfare, perception often matters more than reality. What the German leadership believed shaped their actions more powerfully than the actual facts of the situation. Behind closed doors in London, as reports confirmed the success of the operation, Montagu and Cholmondeley allowed themselves a moment of satisfaction. Their psychological insight had paid off beyond their expectations, yet both men understood the profound moral complexity of what they had done, using a dead body as a tool of deception, creating elaborate fictions, and manipulating the perceptions of their enemies, all justified by the lives their deception would ultimately save. This moral ambiguity is inherent in psychological warfare, where the battlefield extends into the human mind itself. The success of Operation Mincemeat reverberated beyond its immediate military impact. The operation inspired future deception operations throughout the remainder of the war. The same team would go on to create elaborate deceptions for the D-Day landings, once again manipulating German perceptions to suggest that the main invasion would come at Pas-de-Calais rather than Normandy. The psychological insights gained through mincemeat about how to create believable fictions, how to exploit institutional vulnerabilities, and how to reinforce existing beliefs became part of the Allied psychological warfare playbook. The operation also created a legacy of distrust within German intelligence that undermined their effectiveness for the remainder of the war. Having been fooled once in such a spectacular fashion, German analysts became more hesitant to trust even genuine intelligence, creating a kind of psychological blowback that further benefited Allied operations. The legacy of this useless letter extends into our contemporary world in ways both obvious and subtle. The basic psychological principles exploited by Operation Mincemeat remain relevant in today's information environment. The tendency to give greater credence to information that appears to be obtained clandestinely or accidentally still shapes how we process and trust information. The vulnerability of organizations to deception that confirms existing biases continues to challenge institutional decision-making. The power of physical evidence to create credibility, even when that evidence is fabricated, still influences how we determine what is real and what is false. In an age of deepfakes, social media manipulation, and information warfare, the story of a single deceptive letter that fooled the Nazi high command offers both warning and insight. It reminds us how fragile our perception of reality can be, how easily institutional systems can be manipulated, and how profoundly our existing beliefs shape what new information we accept as true. The modern information environment, with its overwhelming volume and velocity of data, creates new vulnerabilities to psychological manipulation that even the architects of Operation Mincemeat could not have imagined. In 2010, the British government finally declassified the last remaining files related to Operation Mincemeat, revealing the full extent of the deception and the meticulous attention to psychological detail that made it successful. The story emerged as one of the most extraordinary examples of psychological warfare in military history. A single letter that changed the course of the war and saved countless lives by exploiting fundamental aspects of human cognition and institutional behavior. The operation succeeded because its planners understood something essential about how the mind processes information and how organizations make decisions. They recognized that the most powerful deceptions are those that target not just what people think, but how they think. As you reflect on this historical operation, consider how these same psychological principles might be operating in your own information environment. In what ways might your perceptions be shaped by similar techniques? What obvious facts do you accept that might be carefully constructed fictions? How do your existing beliefs and institutional contexts influence what information you trust and what you dismiss? In a world where information itself has become a primary battlefield, the story of Operation Mincemeat serves as both a fascinating historical curiosity and a relevant cautionary tale. The letter that fooled Hitler's high command reminds us that sometimes the most powerful weapons are not those that destroy bodies, but those that influence minds. And in that recognition lies a profound truth about both the past we study and the present we navigate. Reality is not merely what exists, but what we perceive to exist. That gap between existence and perception, that is where psychological warfare lives, where a single useless letter can change the course of history.